No alien wanted to hire this single mom, until a human changed her fate. What if you were a single mother, shunned by an alien underworld, your strange child's glowing eyes marking you as outcasts, until a human stranger offered you a lifeline that could rewrite your destiny among the stars? Today, I, your storyteller from the Sci-Fi Nebula channel, will whisk you away to the gritty, pulsing chaos of Dusthaven, a derelict orbital station where survival hangs by a thread and hope flickers in the shadows. Stick with us to the end, because the heart-pounding twist in Chapter 4 will leave you reeling. Before we blast off into this tale, please hit that like button and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the stardust that powers our cosmic adventures. Curious about what stories we should explore next? Drop your ideas in the comments, or simply leave a 1 if this grips you, or a 0 if we need to tweak the orbit. Now, let's dive into the vast expanse of the universe together. Chapter 1, Shadows of Dusthaven. The orbital station of Dusthaven hung like a jagged scar against the blackened void of Zarian 9, a planet long dead beneath its shroud of ash and silence. Its skeletal frame, patched together from the husks of abandoned starships, groaned under the weight of its own existence. Pulse cores, ancient, glowing orbs of energy scavenged from forgotten tech, cast a sickly blue light across the lower tiers, where the air was thick with the stench of oil and desperation. Here, in the underbelly of the station, the marketplace thrummed with a chaotic symphony, the clatter of Clyther wings, the hiss of Sethron cybernetics, and the low murmur of human voices bartering for scraps. Zyra Veloris moved through the crowd like a ghost, her silver skin dulled to a muted gray as she willed it to blend with the shadows. Her hair, a cascade of metallic strands, was tucked beneath a tattered hood. Beside her, clutching her hand, was Elara, her 5-year-old daughter, whose pale face and emerald-green eyes glowed faintly in the dimness. The girl's gaze darted to every rusted machine they passed, as if she could hear secrets in their creaks and whirs. Zyra tightened her grip, whispering, "Just a little longer, my star," though her voice trembled. Their last credits, barely enough for a night in the slums, jingled faintly in her pocket. She approached a Sethron vendor, his crystalline body studded with mechanical implants, his 4 arms sorting scrap metal with eerie precision. "Work," Zyra said, keeping her tone low. "Anything, cleaning, repairs." The Sethron's optics whirred, scanning her up and down, then lingered on Elara. "No outsiders," he rasped, his voice a grating buzz. "Especially not with that." He gestured at Elara, whose eyes flared briefly before Zyra pulled her back. "Move along, freak." Zyra swallowed the sting of his words, her chest tightening as she turned away. She'd heard it all before: Clyther merchants, human scavengers, even the station's dregs had spat their disdain. No one wanted a Lunareth and her strange child. The crowd pressed in, a suffocating tide of bodies and noise. Zyra's stomach growled as they passed a stall wafting the scent of roasted synth meat, but she quickened her pace. Then, a shadow loomed, a hulking figure in a hooded cloak, his hand brushing a blaster at his hip. Another step from an alley, their movements too deliberate. Bounty hunters. Zyra's heart lurched. She'd known this day would come, someone had recognized her, or Elara's glow had betrayed them. "Run," she hissed, yanking Elara toward a narrow gap between stalls. The chase was a blur of panic. Zyra's skin shifted to match the rusted walls, a Lunareth trick honed by years of survival, but Elara stumbled, her small hand slipping free. A pulse core embedded in a nearby pillar flared to life, its blue light pulsing wildly as Elara reached out instinctively. The hunters froze, startled by the sudden glow, and Zyra seized the moment, scooping Elara up and darting deeper into the maze of the lower tier. Shouts echoed behind them, "There! The kid!" But the crowd swallowed their pursuit. Breathless, Zyra rounded a corner and slammed into a solid figure. She staggered back, Elara clutched tight against her chest, and looked up into a pair of sharp, hazel eyes set in a weathered human face. The man was tall, his sun-bleached hair cropped short, his work jacket stained with grease but oddly well kept amidst Dusthaven's filth. "Watch your step," he said, his voice low and steady, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. His gaze flicked to Elara, then back to Zyra, lingering with a curiosity that made her skin prickle. I'm sorry, Zyra stammered, stepping back, her hood slipping slightly to reveal a glint of silver. She braced for the inevitable scorn, the demand to move on, but it didn't come. Instead, the man tilted his head, studying her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. "You're running from something," he said, not a question, but a statement. Zyra tensed, her free hand curling into a fist. "Or someone," he added, glancing over her shoulder toward the fading shouts. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to keep Elara hidden, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The man's presence was disarming, not threatening, not yet, but piercing in a way that made her feel seen. "Name's Kael Torren," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I run Stellar Forge, a shop down by the docking rim. You look like you could use a break." His tone was casual, but his eyes held a weight she couldn't place. Zyra hesitated, her mind racing. Kindness in Dusthaven was a rarity, and it often came with a price, credits she didn't have, or worse. But Elara shifted in her arms, her small voice piping up, "Mama, he's got machines." The girl's eyes sparkled, fixed on the faint hum of a tool dangling from Kael's belt. Zyra's resolve wavered. They couldn't keep running, not with hunters on their tail and no credits left. "What kind of break?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The kind where you don't have to dodge blasters for a few hours. Come with me, we'll talk." He turned, gesturing toward a side passage leading away from the market's chaos. Zyra glanced back, the hunters' voices now lost in the din, then down at Elara, whose hopeful gaze pierced her heart. Against every shred of caution, she nodded. "Lead the way." The passage wound through Dusthaven's underbelly, its walls a patchwork of scavenged metal and flickering lights. Kael moved with a quiet confidence, his steps sure despite the uneven floor. Zyra followed, her mind a storm of doubt and desperation. She'd spent years hiding, from Nova Praxis, from her past, from the truth of what Elara could do. Kael Torren was a stranger, a human in a station that chewed up trust and spat it out. Yet something in his steady gait, in the way he hadn't flinched at her silver skin or Elara's glow, gnawed at her. Hope, maybe. Or a trap. As they neared the docking rim, the hum of machinery grew louder, a comforting pulse that seemed to call to Elara. The girl squirmed, eager to see more, and Zyra tightened her hold. Whatever Stellar Forge held, salvation or betrayal, she'd face it head-on. For Elara, she had no choice. The shadows of Dusthaven stretched behind them, but ahead, a faint light beckoned. Zyra took a breath and stepped into it. Chapter 2, A Chance in the Dark. The docking rim of Dusthaven buzzed with the low hum of machinery, a stark contrast to the chaotic clamor of the marketplace. Stellar Forge loomed ahead, a sprawling workshop carved from the gutted remains of an old freighter. Its hull was pocked with rust, but the faint glow of pulse cores embedded in its walls cast a warm, steady light. Inside, the air smelled of scorched metal and engine grease, a scent that wrapped around Zyra Veloris like a familiar shroud. She stepped through the wide bay doors behind Kael Torren, Elara still cradled in her arms, her silver skin prickling under the weight of his offer. Kael gestured to the cluttered space, workbenches strewn with tools, half-assembled engines dangling from cranes, and a sleek scout ship perched in the center, its hull stripped open like a dissected beast. "Not much to look at," he said, his voice carrying over the software of a cooling unit, "but it keeps the lights on." He turned to Zyra, his hazel eyes sharp but not unkind. "I need someone to keep this place from falling apart, cleaning, sorting parts, maybe some light repairs if you've got the hands for it. There's a corner over there you can use as a bump. No charge." Zyra's gaze darted to the corner he'd indicated, a small alcove with a cot, a dented storage locker, and a curtain for privacy. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in months. Still, her stomach twisted. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, almost lost in the hum of the shop. "You don't know me. Why take the risk?" Kael shrugged, leaning against a workbench, his fingers brushing a wrench as if testing its weight. "I've got a knack for spotting people who need a break. And Dusthaven's short on good help, most folks here are too busy chasing quick credits to stick around." Elara squirmed free, her small feet hitting the floor with a soft thud. Before Zyra could stop her, the girl darted toward a rack of spare parts, her emerald eyes wide with wonder. She reached for a pulse core, a fist-sized orb pulsing faintly with blue light, and it flared brighter at her touch, emitting a low, resonant hum. Zyra lunged forward, heart pounding. "Elara, no," she snapped, pulling her daughter back. The core dimmed, but not before Kael's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. "Just a glitch," Zyra said quickly, forcing a smile. "She's curious." Kael didn't respond right away, his gaze lingering on Elara, then shifting to Zyra. "Curious," he echoed, his tone neutral but laced with something she couldn't read. He straightened, brushing dust from his jacket. "Well, she's welcome to look, just keep her away from anything that sparks." Zyra nodded, her throat tight, but Elara's delighted giggle as she peered at a pile of circuits eased the tension in her chest. For a moment, she let herself imagine it, a place to rest, a roof over their heads, a chance to breathe. The moment shattered when a sharp clang echoed from the bay doors. A battered cargo drone rolled in, towing a smoking scout ship, its engines coughing sparks. A wiry Clyther pilot hopped out, his metallic wings twitching irritably. "Torren. This heap's gotta be space-worthy by dawn, or I'm out of contract," he barked, his voice a shrill buzz. Kael cursed under his breath, then glanced at Zyra. "No time like the present. Grab that toolkit, red case, left bench, and follow me." Zyra hesitated, then obeyed, hefting the heavy case with a practiced ease she hoped he wouldn't notice. They approached the ship, its hull scorched and leaking coolant. Kael knelt by the engine bay, prying open a panel with a grunt. "Hand me the spanner," he said, not looking up. Zyra complied, her fingers brushing his as she passed the tool. The contact sent a jolt through her, unexpected and unnerving. She pulled back, focusing on the task as Kael wrestled with a tangle of fried wiring. The Clyther hovered nearby, muttering complaints, but Zyra's attention drifted to the ship's power grid, a mess of overloaded circuits and a misaligned pulse core. Her hands itched to fix it, she'd spent years tuning engines like this in the Lunareth fleet. "You're wasting time," she said before she could stop herself. Kael paused, glancing up with a raised eyebrow. "That core's out of sync, reroute the secondary feed, or it'll blow the whole system." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken questions. Then Kael handed her the spanner, his expression unreadable. "Show me." Zyra took it, her movements swift and sure as muscle memory took over. She bypassed the damaged feed, realigned the core, and sealed the panel with a deft twist. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, its hum steady and strong. The Clyther let out a surprised chirp. "Well, damn. You're hired, Torren, keep her." Kael stood, wiping grease from his hands, his gaze fixed on Zyra. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, his voice low, probing. She met his eyes, her mind racing for a lie. "Picked it up, watching others," she said weakly, turning away to hide the flush creeping up her neck. He didn't press, but the weight of his stare followed her as the Clyther paid and left, the drone dragging the repaired ship back into the night. Later, as the shop quieted, Kael approached her by the alcove. Elara was curled on the cot, clutching a scrap of wire like a toy, her breathing soft and even. "She's out cold," he said, nodding toward the girl. "You should rest too. Work starts at first shift, 0600. Zyra forced a nod, her fingers tightening on the curtain. "Thank you," she murmured, the words tasting foreign after so long without kindness. Kael lingered, his hands in his pockets. One thing, he said, his tone shifting, harder now. Dusthaven's a small place. Secrets don't stay buried long, not from me, not from anyone. If you're hiding something, I'll figure it out. Just don't make me regret this. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back. And keep that kid away from the cores. They don't glitch like that on their own. Zyra watched him go, his silhouette swallowed by the shop's shadows. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a mix of relief and dread coiling in her gut. She'd bought them a night, maybe more, but at what cost? Kael Torren wasn't like the others who'd turned her away. He saw too much, asked too little, and that made him dangerous in ways she couldn't yet name. She sank onto the cot beside Elara, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. The faint glow in Elara's eyes had faded, but Zyra knew it wouldn't stay hidden forever. Outside, the storm from Zarian 9 rattled Dusthaven's hull, a low growl that echoed her unease. Stellar Forge was a lifeline, a fragile thread in a web of threats she couldn't outrun. Nova Praxis was still out there, their hunters circling like vultures, and now Kael Torren stood between her and the abyss. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, not yet. But as she closed her eyes, the hum of the shop's pulse cores lulled her into an uneasy sleep, a promise of respite she hadn't felt in years. Chapter 3, Secrets Unraveled. The night settled over Stellar Forge like a heavy cloak, the faint blue glow of pulse cores casting eerie shadows across the workshop's cluttered expanse. Outside, Dusthaven shuddered as a storm from Zarian 9 unleashed its fury, tendrils of energy crackling against the station's hull. Inside, the air was still, punctuated only by the soft hum of machinery and the occasional clink of tools. Zyra Veloris stood at a workbench, her silver hands deftly tuning an old engine manifold she'd salvaged from the scrap pile. The task was mindless, a tether to keep her thoughts from spiraling into the past she'd buried, or the future she couldn't predict. Elara slept in the alcove, her small form curled beneath a threadbare blanket, but Zyra couldn't rest. The weight of Kael Torren's words lingered, secrets don't stay buried long, and every creak of the shop felt like a warning. She tightened a bolt, her mind drifting to the Lunareth fleet, to the sterile labs where she'd once designed engines like this, oblivious to the horrors Nova Praxis had planned for her daughter. The memory clawed at her, sharp and cold, but she shoved it down, focusing on the hum of the manifold as it sparked to life. Footsteps broke her reverie. Kael emerged from the shadows, his jacket slung over one shoulder, a steaming mug in his hand. "You're up late," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge of curiosity. He set the mug on the bench, a rich, earthy scent wafted up, unfamiliar yet warm. "Thought you might need this. Real coffee, rare out here." Zyra hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a shiver through her, and she hid it behind a sip, the bitter heat grounding her. "Thanks," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. He leaned against the bench, arms crossed, watching her work with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You're good at this," he said after a moment. "Too good for someone who just picked it up. Where'd you really learn?" Zyra's grip tightened on the mug, her mind racing for a deflection, but his hazel eyes pinned her in place. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I was a mechanic, back home. Lunareth. Before things got complicated." Kael's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Lunareth, huh? Heard they build ships that could outrun a supernova. What's a Lunareth mechanic doing in a dump like Dusthaven?" His tone was light, but the question cut deep. Zyra set the mug down, her hands trembling slightly. "Running," she said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. She met his gaze, bracing for judgment, but found something else, understanding, maybe, or a shadow of his own pain. He nodded slowly, then surprised her by speaking. "I ran too, once. Nova Praxis hit my homeworld, mining colony, nothing special. Took my folks, my sister, everything. Built this place to keep going, maybe hit back someday." His voice was steady, but his fingers clenched into fists, betraying the weight of the memory. Zyra's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this, a shared wound, a thread connecting them across the void. "I'm sorry," she said softly, and meant it. Before he could respond, a sharp rap echoed from the bay doors. Kael straightened, his hand brushing the blaster at his hip as he moved to check the scanner. "Relax," he said, glancing at the screen. "Just Jexa." The doors slid open, admitting a wiry human woman with short-cropped hair and a cocky grin. Her coveralls were stained with oil, and she carried a crate of parts slung over one shoulder. "Boss," she greeted Kael, then nodded at Zyra. "New blood, huh? Hope she's worth the trouble." Zyra tensed, but Kael waved it off. "Jexa's my old second, keeps the gears turning when I'm out." "Jexa, this is Zyra." The woman smirked, dropping the crate with a clang. "Nice hands," she said, eyeing the manifold. "Don't screw up my shop, all right?" Her tone was playful, but something in her gaze, too sharp, too lingering, set Zyra on edge. Jexa chatted with Kael about a supply run, her words casual, but Zyra caught the flicker of a comm device in her pocket, its light blinking faintly. She filed it away, unease gnawing at her. A soft cry from the alcove interrupted them. Zyra turned to see Elara sitting up, her emerald eyes glowing faintly, her small hands clutching the blanket. "Mama," she whimpered, "they're talking again." Zyra rushed to her, kneeling beside the cot. "Who's talking, my star?" she asked, brushing hair from the girl's face. Elara pointed to the pulse core on the workbench, its light pulsing in sync with her words. "The machines. They're loud tonight." Kael approached, his brow furrowing as he watched Elara. "Nightmare?" he asked, but Zyra shook her head, her heart racing. Before she could stop her, Elara slipped from the cot and padded to the bench. She reached for a pile of scrap, wires, a gear, a tiny power cell, and her eyes flared bright. The pieces lifted into the air, guided by an invisible force, snapping together with a soft click. In moments, a small, whirring drone hovered before them, its lights blinking in a cheerful pattern. Jexa let out a low whistle. "Well, damn. Kid's got tricks." Kael's jaw tightened, his gaze darting to Zyra. "That's no glitch," he said, his voice low, insistent. "What is she?" Zyra pulled Elara close, the drone settling to the bench as the girl's glow faded. "She's special," she said, her throat dry. "It's why we're here. Why we can't go back." Kael stepped closer, his expression a mix of awe and suspicion. "Special how? And who's after her?" Zyra opened her mouth to answer, but the words caught as Jexa's comm beeped softly. The woman glanced at it, her grin faltering for a split second before she covered it with a laugh. "Gotta run, client's impatient." "See you, boss." She slipped out, leaving a chill in her wake. Zyra's instincts screamed, Jexa had seen too much, and that comm wasn't idle chatter. Kael knelt beside Elara, his voice softening. "Hey, kiddo, that was impressive. You okay?" Elara nodded, leaning into Zyra, her small hand finding his sleeve. "You're nice," she mumbled, and Zyra's heart skipped. Kael smiled, a real one this time, then stood, his eyes locking with Zyra's. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Alone." They stepped away from the alcove, the storm's rumble filling the silence. "She's why you're running," he said, not a question. Zyra nodded, her resolve crumbling under his steady gaze. "Nova Praxis wants her, her gift. I won't let them have her." Kael's face darkened, but before he could speak, he closed the distance between them, his hand brushing her arm. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice rough with something raw. Zyra froze, then leaned into him, their lips meeting in a tentative, desperate kiss, until a distant clang from the bay doors jolted them apart. "Trouble?" she whispered, breathless. Kael grabbed his blaster, his jaw set. "Maybe." Stay with her. He moved to check, leaving Zyra reeling. The kiss lingered, a spark in the dark, but the shadows of Dusthaven pressed closer, and she knew their fragile peace wouldn't last. Chapter 4, The Assault of Nova Praxis. The air in Stellar Forge vibrated with the distant howl of Zarian 9's storm, a relentless growl that seeped through Dusthaven's hull. Zyra Veloris stood by the alcove, her silver hands cradling Elara as the girl drifted back to sleep, the faint glow of her emerald eyes dimming beneath heavy lids. The kiss with Kael Torren still burned on her lips, a fleeting warmth now overshadowed by the clang that had jolted them apart. He stood near the bay doors, blaster in hand, his silhouette taut against the flickering light of the pulse cores. "Stay back," he muttered, peering at the scanner. "Something's off." Before Zyra could respond, the doors shuddered, a low groan echoing as they buckled inward. Red lights flared across the shop, warning signals from the station's grid. Kael cursed, slamming a fist on the control panel. Intruders. Multiple signatures, armed heavy. His eyes met hers, sharp with urgency. "Get her out of sight, now." Zyra scooped Elara up, her heart hammering as she ducked behind a stack of crates, the girl stirring groggily in her arms. "Mama?" Elara mumbled, but Zyra hushed her, pressing them both into the shadows. The doors exploded inward with a deafening blast, shrapnel raining across the workshop. A squad of Nova Praxis enforcers stormed in, hulking figures in black exosuits, their visors glowing crimson, plasma rifles humming with lethal charge. Leading them was Jexa, her cocky grin replaced by a cold smirk. "Told you I'd be back, boss," she said, her voice dripping with mockery as she leveled a pistol at Kael. "Hand over the kid, and maybe you walk away." Kael didn't flinch, his blaster raised in a steady grip. "You sold us out," he growled, his tone laced with betrayal. "For what, credits? Or did they promise you a shiny new ship?" Jexa shrugged, stepping closer. "Survival, Torren. Nova Praxis doesn't mess around. They want that freak's kid, and I'm not dying to play hero." Zyra's blood ran cold, her arms tightening around Elara. She'd known Jexa was trouble, but this was a knife in the dark. The enforcers fanned out, their boots clanging against the metal floor. Kael fired, a bolt sizzling past Jexa's head and slamming into a soldier's chest plate, dropping him with a sparking thud. Chaos erupted, plasma shots lit the air, scorching workbenches and melting tools. Kael dove behind a dismantled engine, returning fire with grim precision, but he was outnumbered. Zyra's mind raced. They couldn't fight this, not here, not now. Elara whimpered, her small hands clutching Zyra's sleeve. "They're loud," she whispered, her eyes flaring green as the pulse cores around the shop began to pulse erratically. Zyra glanced at the nearest orb, its light surging in time with her daughter's fear. An idea sparked, desperate and dangerous. "Elara," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "can you make them louder?" The girl nodded, her glow intensifying as she reached out with trembling fingers. The cores responded instantly, their hum escalating into a piercing wail. The enforcers faltered, clutching their helmets as the sound overloaded their comms. Jexa spun toward the noise, her pistol wavering. "What the hell?" she started, but Kael seized the moment, lunging from cover and tackling her to the ground. They grappled, his blaster skidding across the floor as her knife flashed, slicing a shallow gash across his arm. He grunted, pinning her wrists, but a second enforcer loomed, rifle raised. Zyra acted without thinking. She set Elara down, grabbed a wrench from the crate, and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the enforcer's visor, cracking it and sending him staggering. Kael broke free, snatching his blaster and firing point-blank, dropping the soldier in a heap. Jexa writhed beneath him, spitting curses, but he slammed her head against the floor, knocking her out cold. "Stay down," he snarled, blood dripping from his arm as he stumbled to his feet. The remaining enforcers rallied, their rifles trained on Kael, but the pulse cores hit a fever pitch, their light blinding. Elara's hands shook, her face pale with effort. Too much, she gasped, and Zyra scooped her up, panic clawing at her throat. Kael, we've got to go, she shouted over the din. He nodded, grabbing a satchel from a bench and tossing it to her. Back exit, move. They bolted through the shop, dodging plasma fire as the cores erupted in a cascade of sparks. The walls trembled, metal groaning as the overload destabilized the station's grid. They burst through a narrow hatch into Dusthaven's lower corridors, the roar of collapsing machinery echoing behind them. Zyra's lungs burned, Elara's weight dragging at her arms, but Kael's steady presence beside her kept her moving. He slammed the hatch shut, welding it with a quick blast from his tool belt. That won't hold them long, he panted, his sleeves soaked red. The corridor shook as an explosion rocked the station. Elara's overload had torn through Stellar Forge, and likely half the docking rim. Alarms blared, red lights painting the walls in frantic pulses. Zyra's stomach dropped. I didn't mean, she started, but Kael cut her off, his hand on her shoulder. You saved us. That's what matters. His voice was rough, but his grip was steady, grounding her. A new sound cut through the chaos, a sleek hum, distinct from the station's din. A small, silver craft descended from an overhead shaft, its hull gleaming despite the grime. The hatch slid open, revealing a figure in a dark cloak, his skin a deep, shimmering silver, lunareth, like Zyra. Sister, he said, his voice cool but urgent, you've made quite a mess. Zyra froze, recognition hitting her like a blow. Voren, she breathed, stepping back instinctively. Kael raised his blaster, but Voren raised a hand. No time for that, human. I'm here to get you out, Nova Praxis won't stop at this. He stepped aside, gesturing to the craft. Nexus Vault. It's your only shot. Zyra's mind reeled. Her brother, pragmatic, ruthless Voren, here, now. Why? She demanded, clutching Elara tighter. Voren's eyes, cold and silver, met hers. Because they're not just after her anymore. They want you both. Get in. Kael lowered his weapon, his jaw tight. He's right, those ships out there aren't leaving empty-handed. He turned to Zyra, blood streaking his face, his voice low but fierce. Your call. She looked at Elara, pale and trembling, then at Kael, his steady hazel eyes anchoring her in the storm. Okay, she said, her voice breaking. But you're coming with us. Voren smirked faintly as they climbed aboard, the craft's engines humming to life. A human protector, he mused, sealing the hatch. Interesting choice, sister. The ship lifted off, weaving through Dusthaven's collapsing tiers as Nova Praxis drones swarmed the wreckage below. Zyra sank into a seat, Elara in her lap, and met Kael's gaze across the cabin. They want her gift, she said softly, finally giving him the truth. She can control tech, talk to it. Nova Praxis wants to turn her into a weapon. Kael's face hardened, his hand finding hers, his grip warm despite the blood. They'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice a vow. We're in this together now. Zyra nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as the craft shot into the void, Dusthaven's lights fading behind them. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't alone. Chapter 5, Trials of Nexus Vault. The void stretched endlessly beyond the viewport of Voren's sleek craft, a sea of black pierced by the faint glint of distant stars. Zyra Veloris sat rigid in her seat, Elara nestled against her chest, the girl's emerald eyes half-closed with exhaustion. Kael Torren slumped across from her, his arm hastily bandaged, the bloodstains on his sleeve a stark reminder of Dusthaven's collapse. Voren stood at the helm, his silver skin shimmering faintly as he piloted them toward Nexus Vault, a forgotten relic adrift in the cosmos, its coordinates a whispered legend among scavengers and outcasts. Nexus Vault, Voren said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engines. An archive of ancient tech, guarded by an AI older than our bloodline. If we're lucky, it'll shield us from Nova Praxis. If not, He trailed off, his cold gaze flicking to Elara. Zyra tightened her hold on her daughter, her mind racing. She'd heard of the Vault, whispers from her days in the Lunareth fleet, tales of a place where machines judged the worthy and devoured the rest. And if it rejects us, she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Kael leaned forward, wincing as he shifted his injured arm. Then we fight our way out. Same as always. His hazel eyes met hers, a flicker of resolve cutting through the weariness. Zyra nodded, drawing strength from his presence. Vorin snorted softly. Optimistic, human. I like that. The craft shuddered as it dropped from hyperspace, revealing Nexus Vault, a colossal structure of interlocking metal spires, its surface pulsing with veins of golden light, suspended in the void like a mechanical heart. They docked in silence, the craft's hatch hissing open to reveal a vast chamber. The air thrummed with energy, the walls lined with crystalline panels that flickered like living circuits. At the center stood a towering figure, an AI construct, its form a fluid blend of metal and light, its voice resonating with an ancient timbre. Seekers, it intoned, its faceless head tilting toward them. I am Keeper. State your purpose. Vorin stepped forward, his cloak billowing. Sanctuary. And power to protect what's ours. The Keeper's light pulsed, scanning them. Power requires worth. Face the trials, or be unmade. Before Zyra could protest, the chamber shifted, walls sliding to form a circular arena. Elara stirred, her glow flaring as she whispered, "It's talking to me." The Keeper's voice softened. The child speaks to us. She may guide you, but the burden is yours. Golden tendrils of energy snaked from the floor, enveloping Zyra and Kael in a shimmering haze. Vorin stepped back, his expression unreadable. Good luck, sister. The haze thickened, and Zyra's world dissolved into memory. She stood in a sterile Lunareth lab, the air heavy with antiseptic and dread. Elara, barely a toddler, lay strapped to a table, her cries piercing as Nova Praxis scientists loomed, their tools glinting. Zyra's hands shook as she saw herself sabotage the lab's core, flames erupting as she fled with her daughter. The fear clawed at her, fear of losing Elara, of failing her again. A voice echoed, "The Keepers, what do you dread?" She choked out, "Them taking her. Turning her into a monster." The scene shifted, and she felt Kael's presence beside her, not physically, but in her mind. His memory unfolded, a mining colony ablaze, Nova Praxis ships raining fire. He knelt by his sister's body, her hand limp in his screams swallowed by the inferno. The Keeper's voice returned, "And you, human?" Kael's voice rasped, failing them. Like I failed her. Zyra reached for him through the haze, their fears intertwining, loss, helplessness, the weight of love they couldn't shield. Elara's voice cut through, small but clear. "Mama, Kael, don't be scared." Her glow flared, a bridge between their minds. Zyra saw Kael as he saw her, strong, silver, a beacon in Dusthaven's dark. He saw her resolve, her flight, her love for Elara burning brighter than fear. The Keeper hummed, "Understanding binds you. Face it together." The haze cleared, leaving them gasping in the arena, hands clasped, tears streaking Zyra's face. Kael squeezed her hand, his breath ragged. "We're enough," he whispered. A distant boom shook the vault, Nova Praxis had found them. Vorin's calm crackled. "They've breached the outer grid, drones and a frigate. We're out of time." The Keeper's light pulsed. The second trial, commitment. The arena filled with shifting images, futures unspooling like threads. Zyra saw Elara captured, her gift twisted into a weapon, her eyes hollow. Kael saw himself alone, Dusthaven's ashes in his hands. Then brighter visions, Elara free, her power healing worlds, Zyra and Kael building a life, their love a shield. "We choose that," Zyra said, her voice firm, pointing to the brighter thread. Kael nodded, his grip tightening. Together. The images merged, but before the keeper could respond, the chamber rocked, a plasma blast tearing through the outer wall. Nova Praxis drones swarmed in, their red optics locking onto Elara. Vorin drew a blade, slashing at one, but more poured through. Elara! Zyra shouted, pulling her close as Kael fired, downing two in quick succession. Elara's eyes blazed green, her small hands rising. "I can help," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The vault circuits flared, golden energy surging at her command. Drones sparked and fell, crushed by invisible force, but the effort drained her, her glow flickered, her knees buckling. "Too much," Zyra cried, catching her. Kael dropped beside them, his hands on Elara's shoulders. "Like we practiced, kiddo, steady, not all at once." He guided her, his voice calm, and the energy stabilized, a controlled wave pushing the drones back. The keeper's voice rang out. "Remarkable. The child communes with us." Vorin grinned, slashing another drone. "It's working, they're retreating." The frigate outside faltered, its weapons silenced by the vault's awakened defenses. The keeper pulsed brighter. "Final trial, unity. Merge your strengths." The arena glowed, crystalline patterns forming, mechanical and ethereal, a test of mind and skill. Zyra and Kael worked as one, her Lunareth instinct syncing with his engineering grit. She traced the patterns, her fingers dancing over circuits she'd known since childhood, while Kael adjusted their flow, his hands steady despite the pain in his arm. Elara's power wove through, a bridge linking them, her glow soft but sure. The chamber erupted in light, the patterns locking into place. When it faded, golden marks shimmered on their skin, Zyra's wrist, Kael's chest, binding them to the vault's will. "You are one," the keeper declared. "Sanctuary is yours." Vorin sheathed his blade, a rare smile breaking his stoic mask. "Well done, sister." Zyra sagged against Kael, Elara cradled between them. "We did it," she breathed, exhaustion mingling with relief. Kael pulled them close, his voice rough. "Family sticks together." Elara giggled faintly. "The vault likes us." Outside, the frigate's retreat signaled a fragile victory, but Zyra knew Nova Praxis wouldn't relent. Kael met her gaze, his hand brushing her cheek. "Back to Dusthaven?" he asked. She nodded, a spark of hope igniting. "Not to hide, to fight." The vault hummed, its light a promise of power yet untapped, and for the first time, Zyra believed they could win. Chapter 6, A New Alliance and an Open Future. Dusthaven shimmered in the void, its jagged silhouette softened by the glow of rebuilt pulse cores. Weeks had passed since the flight from Nexus Vault, and the station bore the scars of its rebirth, crumbled tiers patched with fresh metal, lights flickering with renewed life. Zyra Veloris stood at the edge of Stellar Forge's rebuilt docking bay, her silver skin catching the faint blue hue of the cores. Beside her, Kael Torren adjusted a diagnostic tool, his arm now healed, though a faint scar traced where Jex's knife had struck. Elara darted between them, her emerald eyes glowing as she chased a tiny drone she'd crafted from scraps. The station wasn't just a refuge anymore, it was a beacon. Zyra and Kael had returned not to hide, but to build. With the vault's tech humming in their hands, golden marks still shimmering on their skin, they'd fused Lunareth ingenuity with human grit, turning Dusthaven into a hub of resistance against Nova Praxis. The lower tiers buzzed with activity, Clyther engineers traded designs, Sethron traders bartered pulse-powered tech, and humans from forgotten colonies arrived, drawn by whispers of a new alliance. Zyra's heart swelled as she watched, a dream she'd never dared to voice, now taking shape. "Father." Elara called, her voice bright as she tugged Kael's sleeve. "The resonance is off, help me fix it." Kael grinned, kneeling beside her. "Let's see, kiddo. Too much juice in the core." He tweaked the drone, its hum steadying, and Elara clapped, her glow flaring with delight. Zyra smiled, the word father still a quiet marvel. In the month since the vault, Elara had claimed Kael as her own, her trust a bridge that bound them tighter than any trial. He'd taken to it naturally, his steady hands guiding her as her gift blossomed, control over tech growing sharper, more precise. Vorin emerged from the bay's shadows, his cloak traded for a sleek Lunareth tunic, his silver eyes scanning the bustling dock. "Sister," he greeted, his tone warmer than she'd ever heard. "The council's envoy arrived, some are swayed. Your little experiment's making waves." He nodded toward a group of mixed-species couples unloading a supply ship, human and Clyther, Sethron and Lunareth, openly together, inspired by Zyra and Kael's defiance. "They're calling it the Dusthaven Pact," he added, a rare smirk tugging at his lips. Zyra crossed her arms, pride mingling with caution. "Let them talk. Proof's in the work." She gestured to the bay, where a hybrid engine, Lunareth crystal tech fused with human mechanics, purred under a team's care. Productivity had soared, new ships rolling out faster than Dusthaven had ever seen, each one a testament to what unity could forge. Kael stood, brushing dust from his hands. "And it's just the start. Nova Praxis won't sit quiet, they'll hit back." He was right. The frigate's retreat at the vault had bought time, not peace. Reports trickled in, Praxis drones scouting the fringes, their labs churning out war machines. But Dusthaven was ready. Zyra touched the golden mark on her wrist, feeling the vault's power pulse faintly. "Then we'll be stronger," she said, her voice steel. Kael's hand found hers, his calloused fingers warm. "Damn right, princess," he teased, and she elbowed him, a laugh escaping despite the weight of their task. Elara bounded over, holding up a small model, a perfect replica of Stellar Forge as it once was, its tiny cores glowing. "For us," she said, her glow soft but sure. "So we don't forget." Zyra knelt, tracing the model's edges, memories flooding back, the desperate days, the first spark of hope when Kael offered her a chance. "We won't," she promised, pulling Elara into a hug. Kael joined them, his arms encircling both, a quiet strength in his hold. "Some chances change everything," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. The bay doors chimed, admitting a group of newcomers, refugees from Praxis-controlled worlds, their eyes wide with wary hope. Zyra rose, Kael at her side, and greeted them. "Welcome to Dusthaven," she said, her voice carrying over the hum of engines. "You're safe here, for now. Help us build, and we'll keep it that way." The group nodded, some smiling, others clutching tools like lifelines. Elara waved, her drone buzzing cheerfully, and the tension eased, a fragile community taking root. Later, as the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle, Zyra and Kael retreated to their quarters, a small space above the bay, its walls lined with salvaged panels, a viewport framing Zarian 9's ashen glow. Elara slept nearby, her model glowing faintly on a shelf. Kael pulled Zyra close, his lips brushing her neck. "Ever think we'd end up here?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. She smirked, melting into his touch. "Not in a million stars. But I'm glad we did." Their kiss deepened, a hungry edge to it, but a chime from the comm panel broke the moment. Kael groaned, reaching for it as Zyra laughed softly. The hollow flickered to life, revealing Vorin's face, his usual calm tinged with urgency. Scouts picked up a signal, Praxis fleet massing, 3 jumps out. Could be a bluff, but, Zyra's stomach tightened, the warmth fading. "We'll be ready," she said, Kael nodding beside her. "Get the teams prepped," quietly. Vorin signed off, and Zyra turned to the viewport, the void staring back. Kael's arm slipped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "No regrets?" he asked, his voice soft. She leaned into him, the golden mark on her wrist pulsing faintly. "Never. You and Elara, you're my home." He kissed her temple, a silent vow, and they stood together, watching the stars. The next morning, Elara woke them with a gift, a tiny ship, its hull a blend of lunareth silver and human steel, hovering with a hum. "The vault showed me," she said, her glow bright with excitement. "We're stronger now." Zyra smiled, ruffling her hair, while Kael tested the ship's spin. "Kid's a genius," he said, pride in his eyes. "Ready to take on the universe?" Dusthaven pulsed with life below, a fragile alliance forged from desperation and hope. The signal from Nexus Vault lingered in Zyra's mind, a faint, cryptic hum, a promise or a warning. Nova Praxis loomed, but she wasn't the hunted anymore. With Kael's hand in hers and Elara's light leading the way, they'd face whatever came, not as fugitives, but as a family that defied the stars. And that's the end of Zyra, Kael, and Elara's journey, for now. What did you think? Hit that like button, subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula for more epic tales, and drop a comment. Will Dusthaven stand against Nova Praxis? Your support fuels the next adventure, so join us among the stars. And so, we've journeyed through the shadowed depths of Dusthaven, where Zyra Veloris, a shunned lunareth single mother, and her gifted daughter Elara found an unlikely savior in Kael Torren, a human mechanic whose kindness sparked a rebellion, forging a family and a new alliance that turned a crumbling station into a beacon of defiance against Nova Praxis. If this tale lit a spark in you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your quiet encouragement fuels the heart of Sci-Fi Nebula, guiding us to more stories among the stars. Until our paths cross again, keep chasing the unknown.